My name is Naomi Whitfield. I am 34 years old, and until the second week of March, I believed my family was the one stable thing in my life. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning at 8:42. I remember the time because I was standing in my kitchen in Tulsa, Oklahoma, pouring coffee into a chipped blue mug my grandmother had given me 11 years ago, the year I graduated college. My phone buzzed against the counter, and I saw her name on the screen, Eleanor Whitfield. I smiled before I answered, the way you do when a name on a screen still means safety to you. Naomi, she said. Her voice was flat, clipped, nothing like the woman who used to sing off-key while she rolled out pie dough in her kitchen in Broken Arrow. I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting. I set the mug down. The coffee sloshed over the rim and burned the back of my hand, but I barely registered it. You are no longer a beneficiary of the family trust, she said. Effective this morning. My attorney has the paperwork. I don't expect you to understand, and I don't owe you an explanation. I stood there in my socks on the cold tile floor, staring at a spot on the wall where the paint had chipped years ago and I'd always meant to touch up. 81 years old, and she said it like she was reading a grocery list. I asked her why. She said, "Ask your brother." Then she hung up. I called back. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I called again 4 minutes later. Same result. By the third call, her voicemail box was full. I did not have a clean answer for what I felt in that moment. Not grief exactly, not yet. Something closer to the sensation of a floor tilting under you when you didn't know the floor could move at all. Before I tell you what happened next, and before I explain what my brother had to do with any of this, or what the family trust even meant to a woman who had spent 40 years teaching third grade for a salary that never cracked $40,000 a year, tell me, what time is it where you're watching from? Where are you watching from? What's the weather like there? I'm curious how far this story will travel. I stood in that kitchen for a long time. Long enough that the coffee went cold in the mug and I never drank it. I remember the smell of it sitting there, bitter and stale, because I still smell burnt coffee sometimes and think of that morning. To understand why a phone call like that could land the way it did, you have to understand who Eleanor Whitfield was to me, and who I thought I was to her. My grandmother raised me for 6 years, from the time I was 9 until I was 15, after my parents divorced and my mother moved to Denver for a job that never quite worked out the way she hoped. My father was not in the picture in any meaningful way. He sent birthday cards some years and not others. Eleanor didn't ask questions. She just showed up with a station wagon and 2 suitcases worth of my clothes and said, "You'll sleep in the room with the yellow curtains. Your Uncle Ray painted it before he passed." I grew up in that house on Birch Hollow Road. I learned to drive in her Buick. She taught me to balance a checkbook at her kitchen table, the two of us hunched over ledger paper under a lamp that buzzed. When I got my first job at 17, bagging groceries at a Homeland on 71st Street, she was the one who drove me there and back every shift for the first month until I got my license. My brother, Colton, is 4 years younger than me. He did not live with Eleanor the way I did. He stayed with our mother in Denver through most of his teenage years, and he and Eleanor had what I would call a formal relationship, polite, occasional, built on holiday visits and phone calls on birthdays. That changed, I would later learn, in the last 3 years, after Colton moved back to Oklahoma and started visiting her almost every week. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was glad, honestly. I thought, good, she's not alone anymore. I was living 2 hours away by then, working as a claims adjuster for an insurance company, married to a man named David, raising a 6-year-old daughter named Ruthie. I visited when I could, maybe once a month, sometimes less. I called her every Sunday at 7 in the evening, a ritual we'd kept for over a decade. The trust itself was not a mystery to me. Eleanor had set it up 9 years earlier, after my grandfather passed and left her the house, a modest life insurance payout, and a small parcel of land near Coweta that had been in the family since the 1960s. The trust document, which I'd seen once years ago, spread across her kitchen table, named 3 beneficiaries, myself, Colton, and our cousin Priya, my Aunt Denise's daughter. It wasn't a fortune. The land alone was valued at around $110,000, and the house maybe another 90. But it was everything Eleanor had built, and more than that, it was proof that the years she spent raising me, showing up for me, meant something on paper as well as in memory. That Tuesday morning phone call unraveled something I thought was permanent. I called my husband first. David was at work, but he picked up on the second ring. I told him what happened, my voice strange to my own ears, too even, too controlled. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Call Colton." I did. He didn't answer either. That afternoon, I drove to Broken Arrow. It's a 90-minute drive from Tulsa proper if you catch the light traffic on the turnpike, and I made it in 70, my hands tied on the wheel the entire way, that burnt coffee smell still somehow stuck in my throat even though I hadn't had a sip since morning. When I pulled into her driveway, her car was there, but the porch light was off in the middle of the day, which she never did. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder, and called out her name through the door. A voice answered instead, not hers. A man's voice, calm, professional, coming from just inside. "Mrs. Whitfield isn't taking visitors today." I asked who I was speaking to. The man said his name was Gregory Faust, and he was Eleanor's attorney. He said it the way you'd announce a title on a business card, without warmth, without apology. "I'm her granddaughter," I said. "I need to speak with her." "I understand this is difficult," he said, "but I'd advise you to have any further communication go through my office." I stood on that porch for close to 10 minutes after he stopped answering. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that my body didn't do the thing bodies are supposed to do. I just stood there, looking at the yellow curtains still hanging in the window of what used to be my room, and I thought, something is very wrong here, and it is not the something Eleanor thinks it is. I drove home that evening without stopping. Ruthie was already asleep by the time I walked through the door, and David met me in the hallway with a look I recognized, the look he gets when he's trying to decide whether to ask questions or just hold space for me to fall apart. I didn't fall apart. I went straight to the small office off our bedroom, the one we used for bills and school forms, and I pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in almost 2 years. It had a single sticky note on the front in my own handwriting, "Grandma, Trust Docs, Copy 2019. I want to be honest about something." I did not open that folder that night out of some cold, calculated instinct. I opened it because I needed to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the last decade of my life. That the yellow curtains were real. That the ledger paper was real. That I was, on paper, someone's family. Inside was a copy of the original trust document, dated June 14, 2017. I'd kept it after Eleanor asked me to make copies for the family file at the bank. Reading it again, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to the first time, a clause under Section 4, Distribution of Assets, that required a formal amendment, in writing, notarized, with 60 days written notice to all named beneficiaries before any beneficiary could be removed. I read it 3 times. 60 days. Written notice. I had received a 2-minute phone call and a locked door. I called my Aunt Denise the next morning. She's Eleanor's younger sister, 74, sharp as anything, still drives herself to her water aerobics class 3 times a week in Sand Springs. I told her what happened. There was a long silence on the line before she said, "Naomi, I need you to sit down for this, if you're not already." She told me Colton had been coming around a lot more than I realized. Not just visiting, staying overnight some weeks, helping Eleanor with groceries, driving her to doctor's appointments. On its face, that sounded like a grandson stepping up. But Denise said something that stuck in my chest like a fishbone. He brought a man to the house in January. Introduced him as a financial advisor. Eleanor mentioned it to me on the phone like it was nothing. I told her to be careful. She told me to mind my business. I asked for a name. Denise didn't have one. She said Eleanor called him the nice young man who helps with the paperwork. That phrase, the nice young man who helps with the paperwork, became a kind of splinter I couldn't stop touching over the following weeks. I want to go back further, because I think it matters. Colton and I were close as children, before the divorce split our lives into two different houses. I remember him at 7 years old, riding his bike into the drainage ditch behind our old house on Mingo Road because I dared him to, coming up soaked and laughing so hard he couldn't breathe. I remember him crying at 11 when I left for Eleanor's house and he stayed behind with our mother, asking me why I got to go and he didn't. I didn't have a good answer then either. Colton struggled in his 20s. 2 jobs he was fired from, once for what he called a misunderstanding about the register count, once for reasons he never fully explained. A short marriage that ended after 14 months. By the time he was 28, he was living in a rented room above a friend's garage in Bixby, and Eleanor had started, quietly, sending him money. I knew about some of it. $400 here, $600 there, always described to me as a little help, always framed as temporary. What I did not know, what I would only learn in the weeks that followed, was that a little help had become something else entirely. 3 weeks after the phone call, I received a message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in over a year, Priya, Denise's daughter, the third beneficiary named in the original trust. She sent it at 11:14 at night, and I remember the notification lighting up my phone on the nightstand while David slept beside me. It said, "Did Colton call you about the trust?" He called me. Something is off. Priya and I talked on the phone the next day for almost 2 hours. She told me Colton had reached out to her directly, not Eleanor, and asked her to voluntarily step back from the trust, framing it as a favor to their grandmother's peace of mind in her final years. He told Priya that I had already agreed to step back, and that it would be easier on Eleanor if the whole family just simplified things. Priya, to her credit, hadn't agreed to anything. She'd told him she needed to think about it, and then she called me instead. That was the first hard evidence I had that something calculated was happening, not just an old woman's fading judgment or a grandson's overreach, but an actual, coordinated effort. Colton had lied to Priya about my position to isolate her. That meant he understood, on some level, that if the 3 of us beneficiaries compared notes, his story would fall apart. He was managing us the way you manage a leak, one crack at a time, quietly, before anyone notices the whole wall is compromised. I didn't call Colton that night. I wanted to. My hands were shaking with the kind of anger that makes you want to say things you can't take back. Instead, I opened a blank document on my laptop and started writing down dates. March 4th, the phone call. March 4th, afternoon, the locked door, the attorney named Gregory Faust. Denise's account of the nice young man. Priya's message. I didn't know yet what I was building. I just knew that if I was going to understand what had happened to my grandmother's trust, and to my grandmother, I needed something more solid than memory and hurt feelings. I needed a record. The next piece came 4 days later, and it came from a place I hadn't expected, my grandmother's neighbor, Mrs. Odalise Reyes, who had lived 2 doors down from Eleanor on Birch Hollow Road for over 20 years. I'd known her since I was a teenager. She used to give me tomatoes from her garden in the summer, the way older neighbors do when they've decided you belong to the street as much as you belong to a house. She called me on a Saturday morning, her voice careful, the way people sound when they're not sure they should be saying something. "Naomi, honey, I don't want to start trouble," she said, "but I saw something last week I can't stop thinking about." She told me that on the afternoon of February 22nd, 12 days before my phone call, she'd seen a car she didn't recognize parked in Eleanor's driveway for almost 3 hours. A silver sedan. She said Colton's truck was there too, parked behind it. When the 2 men finally left, one of them was carrying a thick manila folder, the kind you'd use for legal documents. Mrs. Reyes said Eleanor didn't come out to wave goodbye, which she always did, every single time anyone visited. "That's not like her," Mrs. Reyes said. She waves. She always waves. I wrote it down. February 22nd. Silver sedan. Manila folder. No wave. The following Tuesday, I drove back to Broken Arrow, this time not to Eleanor's house but to the Tulsa County Assessor's office, and then to the County Recorder's office, where public property records are filed. I'd learned by then, through a family law attorney I'd consulted named Marisol Cantrell, that if any property within the trust had been retitled or transferred, it would show up in the public record regardless of whether the family had been notified. It took less than 20 minutes for the clerk to pull the file. The parcel of land near Coweta, the one valued at roughly $110,000, the piece of land that had been in our family since 1962, had been transferred out of the trust and into a newly formed LLC on February 27. The LLC was called Whitfield Heritage Holdings. The registered agent listed on the filing was Gregory Faust. The managing member listed was Colton Andrew Whitfield. I sat in my car in the parking lot of that county building for a long time. I remember the smell of the vinyl seats warming in the sun, the sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the block, ordinary sounds that felt obscene against what I'd just read. My brother had not simply convinced our grandmother to remove me from a trust. He had, with the help of an attorney, moved a piece of the actual trust property into a company he controlled, 5 days before Eleanor made that phone call to me. Marisol Cantrell explained it to me plainly over the phone that evening. This isn't a family disagreement anymore, Naomi. If your grandmother has diminished capacity, and if this transfer happened without proper trust amendment procedure, you may be looking at undue influence, possibly elder financial exploitation. That's not a civil matter only. That's something Adult Protective Services and potentially the district attorney's office would want to know about. I asked her what I needed to do. She said one word: document. Over the next 18 days, I built a file. I requested Eleanor's recent bank statements through a limited power of attorney my Aunt Denise still held from years earlier, one Colton apparently hadn't known still existed, since Eleanor had never formally revoked it. The statements showed a pattern that turned my stomach. 6 withdrawals over 4 months, each just under $3,000, made in cash from a Bank of Oklahoma branch 9 minutes from Colton's apartment, not from the branch near Eleanor's own house that she'd used for 30 years. Total withdrawn, $17,400. I also found, through Marisol, that Gregory Faust was not, as I'd assumed, a longtime family attorney. He had been retained exactly 6 weeks before my phone call. His office was in a strip mall off 71st Street, above a nail salon. When Marisol called his office under the guise of a routine records request, his assistant let slip that Mr. Whitfield, meaning Colton, had been the one to schedule Eleanor's first consultation and had sat in the room for it. I confronted Colton on the phone on a Thursday night, the 17th of April. I want to be honest, I did not go into that call with a plan to accuse him of anything. I told myself I was calling to ask him, brother to sister, what was going on. But by the end of the conversation, something in me had gone very still and very clear. Grandma's tired of everyone treating her like a bank, he said, when I asked about the land transfer. I'm the one who's actually here, Naomi. I'm the one driving her to dialysis twice a week. Where were you? I hadn't known about the dialysis. That admission, dropped so casually, weaponized as a guilt tactic, was the first time I learned my grandmother was seriously ill, and I learned it from the person actively working to isolate her from the rest of us. Why is there an LLC, Colton? There was a pause. Then, you don't understand how any of this works. I'm protecting the land. If you and Priya got your hands on it, you'd sell it in a week and split the cash. I'm keeping it in the family. It's already in the family, I said. It's in Grandma's trust. That's what a trust is for. Trusts get contested, he said. This is cleaner. Cleaner. That word sat with me for a long time after I hung up. I did not call him back and scream. I did not drive to his apartment. I did the thing Marisol had told me to do from the start. I documented the call, date, time, and as close to verbatim as memory allowed, written down within the hour, and I added it to the file. Then I made an appointment with Adult Protective Services of Tulsa County, and a separate appointment with a geriatric care manager named Louise Okafor, someone Marisol trusted, who specialized in assessing capacity in elder financial exploitation cases. The turning point, if I had to name one single moment, wasn't the land transfer or the withdrawals or even the word cleaner. It was the dialysis. It was realizing that while I had been grieving a phone call, my grandmother had been quietly dying by inches, and the people closest to that fact had used it as leverage instead of telling the rest of us the truth. I stopped reacting after that call. I started building a case. Louise Okafor met with me first, before she ever went to see Eleanor. She was a small, precise woman with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and she asked more questions in the first 10 minutes than anyone else had asked me in 6 weeks. What medications was Eleanor on? Did I know? I didn't, not fully, another fact I should have known and didn't. Had anyone noticed confusion, memory lapses, sudden mood changes? Denise had mentioned, almost in passing, that Eleanor had started calling Priya Denise on the phone twice in the last month, and had once asked Colton, in front of Denise, when I was coming to visit, apparently forgetting the call from March entirely. Louise explained that dialysis itself can cause what's sometimes called dialysis-related cognitive fog, a real, documented phenomenon where fluctuating toxin levels and blood pressure changes during treatment can temporarily and sometimes cumulatively affect decision-making and memory, particularly in patients over 75. It wasn't proof of incapacity on its own. But combined with everything else, it was a thread worth pulling. Louise requested a formal capacity evaluation through Eleanor's nephrologist, a Dr. Amar Singh at St. Francis Hospital, using medical records that Denise's still valid power of attorney allowed us to access. The results, when they came back 19 days later, were not simple. Dr. Singh's written assessment noted that Eleanor experienced intermittent periods of reduced executive function correlating with dialysis sessions, with more stable cognition on non-treatment days. In plain language, on the day Colton had brought Gregory Faust to the house, February 22, Eleanor had undergone a dialysis session that morning. The timing was not an accident. It could not have been. Adult Protective Services opened a formal investigation on May 3. The caseworker assigned was a man named Terrence Boyd, methodical, unhurried, the kind of person who wrote everything down twice. He interviewed me. He interviewed Denise and Priya, and, with more difficulty, since Colton had by then all but moved into the house, Eleanor herself, alone, without Colton present, which required a court order after Colton initially refused to leave the room during a scheduled visit. That refusal, it turned out, was its own piece of evidence. Terrence Boyd noted in his report that Colton's insistence on remaining present during a state-mandated welfare interview, combined with his objection when asked to step outside, was consistent with patterns seen in cases of undue influence and isolation. When Eleanor was finally interviewed alone, on May 19, she told Terrence Boyd something that Marisol later read to me over the phone, her voice careful, like she was handling something breakable. Eleanor said she didn't fully remember agreeing to remove me from the trust. She remembered Colton being upset about money problems. She remembered Gregory Faust's face but not his name. She remembered, clearly, one specific detail, that Colton had told her I had said, on the phone, that I didn't want to deal with any of this anymore and had asked to be taken out of the trust myself. I had never said that. Not once, not to anyone. I want to pause here and say something honest. Reading that report did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel sick. Because it meant my grandmother, the woman who taught me to balance a checkbook, who drove me to my first job every day for a month, had spent nearly 3 months believing I had abandoned her. That the estrangement she'd enforced with a 2-minute phone call had been built, brick by brick, on a lie fed to her by someone she trusted more, someone who was there in person while I was 2 hours away making Sunday calls she was starting to forget she'd received. The district attorney's office, after reviewing the APS findings, the bank records, the LLC filing, and Terrence Boyd's report, filed charges against Colton in late June, exploitation of a vulnerable adult, a felony under Oklahoma law, along with a civil action to void the LLC transfer and restore the Coweta land to the trust. Gregory Faust, facing a bar complaint filed by Marisol on Eleanor's behalf, voluntarily withdrew as counsel of record rather than face a disciplinary hearing, though the DA's office indicated he remained a person of interest in the broader financial exploitation inquiry. None of that happened quietly. Word moves fast in a family, faster in a small town like Broken Arrow, and by the first week of July, my mother knew, my Aunt Denise's whole church knew, and Eleanor, lucid, furious, and heartbroken in the specific way only a betrayed grandmother can be, insisted on one thing before any hearing took place. She wanted to see all three of us, myself, Colton, and Priya, in the same room, at her house, on a Sunday afternoon. Marisol advised against it. Terrence Boyd advised against it. I did it anyway, because Eleanor asked, and some debts you pay even when your lawyer tells you not to. We sat in her living room on July 12th, the same room where I used to do homework at her coffee table. Eleanor sat in her recliner, an oxygen line resting under her nose now, something new since I'd last seen her in person. Colton sat across from me, arms crossed, refusing to meet my eyes. Priya sat between us like a buffer neither of us had asked for. I want to hear it from both of you, Eleanor said, her voice thin but steady. Colton. Did you tell me Naomi asked to be removed from the trust? The silence stretched long enough that the ceiling fan's creak became the loudest thing in the room. I was trying to protect you, Colton finally said. You were getting confused about money. I didn't want you making a decision you'd regret. That's not what I asked you, Eleanor said. He didn't answer. Answer her, I said quietly. It was the only thing I said in that entire confrontation, and I said it without raising my voice, because I had promised myself, driving over, that whatever happened, I would not become the person shouting in my grandmother's living room. Answer her, Colton. Yes, he finally said. I told you that. It wasn't exactly true. Eleanor closed her eyes. She didn't cry, not there in front of us, though I heard later from Denise that she cried for a long time that night, alone, after we'd all gone. What she said instead, opening her eyes and looking at her grandson with an expression I will never fully be able to describe, something between grief and a door closing, was simply, get your things out of my house by Friday. Colton pled guilty in October to a reduced charge of attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, avoiding trial in exchange for full restitution and 5 years of probation. The plea agreement required him to pay back the $17,400 withdrawn in cash, plus cover Eleanor's legal fees, which by then had climbed past $9,000. The civil action voided the transfer to Whitfield Heritage Holdings entirely. The Coweta land was returned to the trust in a court order dated November 8, with the LLC dissolved and Colton barred, under the terms of the settlement, from serving as trustee or holding any fiduciary role connected to the estate for the remainder of Eleanor's life. Gregory Faust never faced criminal charges, but the Oklahoma Bar Association's investigation into his conduct was, as of the last update Marisol received, still open. He no longer practices out of the office above the nail salon on 71st Street. Eleanor rewrote the trust in December, this time with Marisol Cantrell present for every meeting and a second, independent attorney appointed by the court to confirm capacity at each stage. Colton was removed as a beneficiary. Priya and I remained. Eleanor also added something new, a clause requiring any future amendment to be reviewed by an independent fiduciary, a safeguard. Marisol told me that Eleanor herself insisted on adding, unprompted, saying only, I don't want this to happen to the next person who trusts the wrong voice in the room. I did not see Colton again that year. He moved to Springfield, Missouri, where I understand he found work at a warehouse distribution center. We have exchanged exactly 4 text messages since the plea agreement, none of them longer than 2 sentences. I don't know if that will ever change. I don't know if I want it to, and I've stopped pretending I owe anyone a clean answer on that question, including myself. What I did instead, in the months that followed, was smaller and quieter than anything in a courtroom. I started driving to Broken Arrow every other Sunday, not just calling. I sat with Eleanor during 2 of her dialysis sessions, holding a paperback I never actually read, just so she'd have a familiar face in the room on the hard days. In February, almost exactly a year after that first phone call, she asked me to help her repaint the room with the yellow curtains, not because anyone was moving in, she said, just because the yellow had gone dull and she wanted to see it fresh again before she couldn't see much of anything. We chose a pale blue instead. She said the yellow had done its job. I think about that phone call sometimes, the one that started all of it, and I no longer feel the flat, cold shock I felt that Tuesday morning in my kitchen. What I feel now is something more complicated, a kind of tired clarity. My grandmother was not the villain of this story, though for a few weeks in March I let myself believe she might be. She was a woman whose body was failing her in ways that made her vulnerable to the one person closest to her, and that person chose, deliberately and more than once, to use that vulnerability instead of protecting it. I have had to hold both of those truths at the same time, that she hurt me, and that she was also being hurt, by someone else, in a way she couldn't fully see until it was almost too late. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't really a single decision you make once. I forgave Eleanor months before I ever said the word out loud, mostly because I understood, once I had the full record in front of me, that the woman who called me that morning wasn't fully the woman I'd grown up with, she was a version of her, worn down and misled. Colton is a harder question, and I've stopped trying to force an answer to it before I'm ready. What I do know, and what I'd tell anyone sitting where I sat that morning in my kitchen, coffee burning the back of my hand, is this: forgiveness is personal, but access must be earned. You can release the anger without reopening the door. Those are not the same act, no matter how many people tell you they should be. So I'll ask you what I've had to ask myself more than once this past year. If someone you loved used the people closest to you to get to something they wanted, your trust, your money, your place in the family, how long would you wait before you started asking questions? And once you had the answers, would you have the courage to act on them, even if it meant losing the version of your family you thought you had? Thank you for watching. Everything in this video is fictional, made only for entertainment and reflection. No real names, families, or events are depicted. If there's one thing worth carrying away from a story like this, it's that healing rarely comes from the moment of confrontation itself, but from the quiet, ordinary choices you make afterward to protect your peace and rebuild what's worth keeping.